Okay, everyone. So we are ready to continue, and it is our immense pleasure to have now the first keynote lecture of Main 2024. It is our pleasure to have Professor Terry Sejnowski with us. Terry Sejnowski is the Francis Crick Professor at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, which he directs. Where he directs the Computational Neurobiology Laboratory and the Crick-Jacobs Center for Theoretical and Computational Biology. He is also professor at the University of California, San Diego, UCSD, in the departments of neuroscience, cognitive science, and physics, the pioneer in neural networks and computational neuroscience. Professor Sejnowski's research focuses on understanding brain mechanisms and behavior. He earned his PhD in physics from Princeton University and has held prestigious academic positions at Johns Hopkins and Caltech. Professor Sejnowski has received numerous accolades, including the 2024 Brain Prize, and co-invented the Boltzmann machine, along with recent Nobel laureate Geoffrey Hinton, advancing both neuroscience and artificial intelligence. We are very, very happy to have Professor Sejnowski with us. Professor Sejnowski was supposed to be here in person, but we heard from him about a week or two ago that he has other constraints that he cannot do that, but he was kind enough to suggest and propose to nonetheless be with us and give his talk remotely over Zoom. So thanks again, Terry, for accepting this invitation. And without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Terry Sejnowski.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm disappointed I can't be there with you. It sounds like a really exciting meeting, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to tell you about a story about state-space dynamics in the cortex and transformers. State-space dynamics is the bedrock of control theory and signal processing. Kalman filters, for example, are state-space models. And what I want to tell you is that these models help us understand how the brain works, specifically the cortex, but also may help us improve the performance of transformers. Now, if I can go to the next slide. So, temporal context is a very important problem that has to be solved by the brain. For example, if you are listening to a lecture, as you are right now, there's a sequence of words coming into your brain, and that has to be processed. And now you have to be able to hook up words that may be quite distant in terms of the beginning of the sentence or the end, or maybe the next paragraph, pronouns. What does this correspond to? And in transformers, that's done with embeddings, where you have sequences of inputs that are represented on a long input vector. Same thing with reading text. Your eyes are making saccades 3 times a second, and that again is going into your brain. And somehow you have to integrate across not just paragraphs but chapters. And video is even more complex. So how do you do temporal context? Well, in recurrent neural networks, language translation, for example, was done by having a recurrent neural network that would take in one word at a time at time steps, and then after a go signal, it would be trained with backprop through time to give a sequence of words in the decoder in the new language that you're translating into. And this worked quite well. You could improve performance by putting in gates with LSTM, but of course transformers now have replaced and have greatly improved language translation. And you're all familiar with it. I just want to point out a couple of the very important parts. Of course, there's the multi-headed attention in both the encoder and decoder arm. And then there is the a long input vector. And then the way that you get a sequence of words out of the transformer is by taking the output, which is going to have a series of probabilities, and then choosing one of the words and sending it into the long input vector and shifting it. And you go around that loop. It's a big loop over and over and over again. Okay, so that's the way, and now it's trained on a huge amount of text just to predict the next word. It's amazing. It's self training. It's self-supervised. Now, there's an interesting analogy between the transformer, this big loop, and the way that the cortex here is the most recent invention by evolution in mammals. And you'll be hearing more about it, but there's, this surface of the brain has this, and it's evolved, especially in humans. But the way that the motor system works is that you have the motor cortex here in color, different parts of the body, and it projects down to a part of the brain just below it called the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is important for learning sequences of actions. And it then loops back to the cortex. So this is a very familiar part of neuroanatomy to neuroscientists, and it's extremely important for being able, for example, to in language to come up with a sequence of words that you're going to now project to the motor system and the spinal cord and the larynx. Okay, so this is a kind of a broad brushstroke. I just want to remind you that one of the most successful reinforcement learning algorithms, which is the prediction error, reward prediction error, temporal difference learning, is based on predicting the next reward. It's a common theme. If you can predict what's going to happen next, you can update the value function, and in the brain we know that this occurs through a series of nuclei. They're called dopamine neurons that project broadly through the cortex and the basal ganglia, and this is one of the most successful theories in systems neuroscience. The prediction came from a paper that I published back in 1996, and it was subsequently confirmed with the recordings in monkeys and brain imaging. Okay, now I want to focus here on the multi-headed attention. It's very important because of the fact that it is able to link together words at different locations in a sentence, and it's a big matrix. And it grows as n squared, and if you have say 1,000 tokens, then it's going to be a million by a million, 1,000 by 1,000. So you have a million entries that have to be learned. It's learned at the same time, of course, as the prediction. Now, I just want to point out one other thing, which is that the multi-headed attention is mixed with the direct input. Here is added and normalized. So it's really a parallel operation that's going on between the input and the attention. Very expensive. And there's another analogy here with the basal ganglia. Here's that loop I was telling you about. Here's the cortex. It's a hierarchy in the visual cortex. Convolutional neural networks are based on what we know about the visual cortex of humans and other primates. And so here's the input coming in at each of these layers. And it projects, of course, up and down. There's feedback connections. We'll come back to that. But then there's this projection down to the basal ganglia and back. Well, the basal ganglia has a lot of neurons in it, and it could well be a source for the self-attention, because every single one of these areas has this feedback. We have a new paper that just came out in a journal, Trends in Neuroscience. If you're interested in following up on this, it just was published a couple of months ago. Okay, now, what is a linear state space model? Here is a simple linear state space model where the inputs are coming in. X is the internal variable. A is the matrix now that is going to be representing the model. And you can see the differential equation has other inputs. And in particular, the output then is projected out. So there's an input matrix and there's an output matrix. So but it's a simple linear differential equation, and in fact, this has been very very well studied mathematically. Now, recently, state-space models have been used in transformers to replace the matrix self-attention. And the reason is that if you pick the right matrix, instead of n squared, it only increases as order n. So here's a tuplets matrix. It's a class of matrices in which diagonals have the same value. You can see here the main diagonal has the same value, and the one above it and so forth. There are only n diagonals. So you only have to learn n values for this matrix. And so there's you probably heard of Mamba, which is one of the early versions in which the state space model was put in here. And you can see that just like the self-attention, it is combined with the input and also can be trained in parameters. So here's the results of various sizes networks of Mamba from 130 million parameters up to 2.8 billion. And all I'm going to do is it's compared here with various other transformer models, the GPT, for example. And what you can see, every one of these metrics, the Mamba does as well, if not better, in bold. So it's competitive. It's really interesting now to understand how it works and why it works. So here now I want to tell you about some recent work that was done in collaboration with Max Welling. Andy Keller was the student at the time, and he wanted to know something about how traveling waves in a recurrent neural network might help improve sequence learning. So here's the simple network, a recurrent network. And we're going to use a starting point that is not small random numbers, but rather an equation here for a traveling wave in which you have ones above the diagonal. It's basically a shift. It's actually a temporal filter. And this is a tuplets matrix, right? So we know that there's, in fact, this case, just very simple. Most of the matrix is 0. So here we were looking at this what's called a convolutional neural network or a wave neural network, and you can see that over time that there is a movement across the network. It's sparse, partially connected, and if you start with small random numbers, you don't get any waves. So what can you do with it? Okay, so here's a very simple task. You have a sequence of inputs coming in, and then the goal is to hold on to it for a variable length of time, and then to repeat it. So here's the wave neural network with 0 time delay. It repeats it perfectly. With 10 time steps, repeats it perfectly. With 30 time steps, and it goes on. You can go up to hundreds of time steps, and it will repeat perfectly. This is now starting with this wave network that I showed you and using backprop through time. If you try to start with small random numbers, you can see it doesn't even do, it immediately starts falling apart, even with 0 time delay, and basically it's completely hopeless for longer time delays. But what's really important here is that look at this now is the mean square error on a log scale as a function of time during training, and what you can see is that the rate at which it learns is 3 orders of magnitude faster than the randomly initiated network. So there's something special about it. It's an induction bias. If you start with the right network, you can actually improve on this class of problems. Now, it turns out that in addition to just remembering, you can also ask it to do something. For example, you can give it, as you're getting inputs of different numbers, you can ask it every once in a while to remember the number and add it. So that at the end, you can then report back what the total was. And here again is the various networks with different time delays. And you can see that the wave network learns orders of magnitude faster, and the performance at the end is much better. You can see with long time delays, randomly initiated networks basically fail completely. So this is amazing. So you can actually compute, and there's a lot of work out now that you can do a lot of other things like variable binding. In fact, you can do a lot of computing, push and pop in stacks. The recursion. These networks are beautiful at recursion. Okay, I'm going to change gears now. I'm going to talk about the brain and something that you may not be as familiar with. This is a levels diagram, and the brain has structures, has molecular structures. It computes with molecules. The connections between the neurons are called synapses, and they have weight in addition to a lot of dynamics. And of course, the neurons are connected to networks, and in the visual cortex, there are maps, and the same thing with the auditory cortex, metasensory cortex. And then finally, that's all put together into a very large central nervous system, including other parts of the brain, not just the cortex. Now, if you look at the connectivity in the cortex, it has a Mexican hat structure. So this is of a neuron, and it's connected with excitatory connections. So this is 0. So there are excitatory connections nearby in a column, which contains a few 100,000 neurons. And then a little bit further away, it has inhibitory connections. And so here's an example of a connection matrix. So you can see down the diagonal, that's excitatory, it's red, and then there's this inhibitory surround. And this line here is basically this Mexican hat. Now, it turns out that this has interesting dynamical properties. It's a line attractor. That is to say, depending on where you start the network, say if you have a one-dimensional circle, it will go down to equilibrium, and it will stay there, but it'll be easily pushed back and forth because it's neutral equilibrium. And it's actually, what it's doing is again, a temporal convolution. Here's an example of a simulation of such a network. Here we have, it's a ring, and the neighboring neurons are excitatorily connected, and then the further away there are inhibitory neurons. So it's a Mexican hat. And I'm going to play this video for you, and you're going to see what a traveling wave looks like. By the way, these are sparse traveling waves. Not all the neurons are activated. That only happens with epilepsy. But in the cortex, it's very sparse. So you can see that there's a variety of they go both directions because it's symmetric. And the velocity here is shown by the slope of this line and the spatial and temporal frequency plot. Now, what we've learned over the last, the couple of decades is that every part of the cortex and in every frequency band, there are traveling waves going back and forth. And this is an example of primary visual cortex in a mouse, a lab of Mark Schnitzer using voltage-sensitive dyes looking down at here's V1. And these are 3 millisecond frames, and you can see that over about 30 milliseconds, there is a wave that passes right through the tissue. And here's the second wave going through the tissue. And here's looking at 3 locations in the cortex. You can see the peak is traveling in one direction here, from the bottom left to the upper right. Now, it's not just, this is the gamma band of 30 to 80 hertz. When you fall asleep, there are what's called a sleep spindle, which are also traveling waves. So you can see the sleep spindle is 10 to 14 hertz, and it's throughout the entire cortex. This is a grid of electrodes that's put into a patient with epilepsy, and we're going to be recording from the surface of the cortex. And here is now the activity. This is the electrical activity in the surface, which is an average over many neurons, normalized to white being 1 and black being -1. So what you can see is that it changes with time. And in fact, if you follow this dot here, the white dots, you can see that they're circulating from one part of the cortex, the temporal cortex, the parietal cortex, the prefrontal cortex. And this is happening thousands of times during the night. This is a very, very robust phenomenon, and it's known to be important for memory consolidation. That is to say, consolidating something you've learned during the day into the cortical connectivity. Now, what's interesting is that every oscillation in the brain is a traveling wave. And here's the hippocampus. All of the different sensory streams feed into the hippocampus. It's at the very top of the hierarchy. And now here's from Thanosiopoulos' lab at Caltech. He put an array of electrodes, and what you can see is that along this left to right, that there is a traveling wave, very robust when the animal, this is a rat, is locomoting. When the rat stops, the waves stop. When the rat falls asleep, something else happens, as you'll see. So here, I'm going to play this movie of the activity. You can see the electrode locations here, and again, it's color-coded. So you can see that it's at 4 to 8 hertz oscillation. It's actually a traveling wave across, this is from the top of the brain to the bottom of the brain. It's huge. This is one of the biggest oscillations in the entire brain. And it's going on, like I say, during the awake state when the animal is exploring. Now, if you look at during that time when the animal is exploring, it turns out that as it moves along this track, there are cells. Each one of these is a cell from 1 to 13, and each one is color-coded according to the location where it fires on the track. These are called place cells. Nobel Prize was given for this discovery. Now, what's interesting is that when the animal goes to sleep, this is replayed. For example, here's now the same cells activated during one of these. It's called a sharp wave ripple. And you can see that it's in the same order, but it's actually about 6 times faster. And it's not just forward, it also goes backwards. And interestingly, this is probably a consequence of the fact that we don't know, but it's very likely that the connectivity in the hippocampus, like the cortex, is a Mexican hat, which is symmetric. Okay, here's now a paper that came out recently. I'm going to go through it very quickly just to give you a sense for what the hippocampus might be doing. So this is a cross-section. This is actually goes back to the early 20th century of Spanish anatomist Ramon y Cajal. Inputs are coming in. It goes to one area, which is pre-processing, dentate gyrus, and from there it goes to CA3, which is a highly recurrent network, and from there it goes to an output area, CA1. This is all, jargon here, but here's a little block diagram. This is the cortex, it's 6 layers. Upper layers go into this recurrent network, CA3, and here's the output. And I want to point something out, which is very interesting and important for this model, is that CA3 gets an input and gives it to CA1 after a time step. There's time steps here in each one of these projections because of the synapses. But CA1 also gets another input from the upper layer, and it can compare what's going on in CA3 with what it gets here a little bit later, right? This is the next step. And now what we're going to do is train up a recurrent network to model CA3, which is going to make a prediction for the next input that's coming in to CA1. So very, very interesting here, the pre-processing. It's dentate gyrus sparsifies, highly recurrent, and then finally it goes back. And so this is the simple diagram. And here's our simple model. Okay, it's an autoencoder, but not reproducing the input, but rather the next input. So it's predicting the next input, and that's the loss function that, as you can see here, we trained it on with backprop through time. So we show that it's possible to train up the network so that it has these place cells. If you go to a new environment where the inputs are now shuffled, the place cells now are shuffled too. Now here's some real data here on the bottom. These are real place cells. As you can see now, we can record here from hundreds. It's now up to tens of thousands at the same time. But here's a recording over a month. And what you see is that there's a huge, at CA1, there's a huge response. These place cells are very robust, but over time it fades. Well, CA1 is basically a prediction error because it's comparing the prediction with the input of the next input. And similarly, it fades away as the backprop through time is predicting better and better. the CA1 responses go away. And this is a completely new interpretation for these CA1 cells. Everybody thought that it was for navigation. No, we think it's for prediction error. Now, everybody says that these recurrent networks and neural networks in general are black boxes. It's not true. There's nothing stopping you from looking inside, and so we did. And here is now, after training up on one environment, one of these sequences, you can see that the positive are red. They are along the diagonal and inhibitory in blue. And if we look at a cross-section here, we get a Mexican hat. We can train it on two different environments. We get two sparse sets of connections within the same recurrent network. They're both Mexican hats. So this is now starting from small random values. And so, it discovered a triplets matrix, which of course supports traveling waves. Okay, well, here's now, let's interpret the hidden units. We trained it on a sequence of MNIST handwritten digits. And so here's the input coming in on two sets of digits. Here's the output after training. You can see that it is able, what you get it started, all you have to do is give it a 0 and it will continue with the rest of the digits. If you start at in the middle, it will continue with the rest of the digits. And now we can analyze the activity pattern in the network with independent component analysis. And interestingly, in the components, you can see it separates very nicely. The different digits have different colors, and by taking pairs, you can see that in 3D, in this case 8D, you're going to have beautiful separation in that space. So this is what's going on inside the recurrent network. We can actually look at it. What else can we do? Well, let's train it to do invariance to rotation. So here's the input. We give it a 0 that's rotating, another input of a 1 that rotates, and we trained it up. And now, after you give it the first 0, it rotates it, and you give it the first 1, and it rotates it. And now we look inside. Now we're using PCA, and you can see that in each case, literally, is a mirror image of the rotation in the network, the activity in the network, and the digits are separated. I mean, we talk about being transparent. I mean, this is really showing that the internal model, the structure of the model, the activity pattern really recapitulates the actual invariance because each of these circles are separated. And now it generalizes to 7 and 8. I don't have time to show you that. I want to show you one more thing. We can do 9 patterns. This is a movie. Just a moment. Busy. We have here sprites. Sprites are these little figures that march along. So it's a sequence of inputs, frames, and each sprite has a different hairdo, and it has it's walking in different directions, and its hand movements and so forth. So we trained it, and here again is an ICA separation. It separated the movies, so it can memorize 9 sequences and separate them out beautifully in terms of identifying each one separately. Now, another interesting feature of the cortex is that, just as in the hippocampus, you can identify layers now instead of areas. There's an area, inputs come from something called the thalamus into layer 4. Like the dentate, it sparsifies. And then it goes to the upper layers that are very highly recurrent. From there down to CA1, which also gets an input from the thalamus. This should remind you of the circuit I just showed you. So, I mean, our hypothesis is that every single part of the cortex is basically using a recurrent network to memorize sequences. And it's using the layer 5 cells as a prediction error in order to train up the network. Now, backprow through time is pretty heavy hammer. Can we find a local learning rule? Well, we resurrected a learning rule that was first introduced by Hinton and McClellan in 1988. And it was a very simple model. You had one layer of hidden units, and you had an input layer, and there were weights that were going up and coming down, U going up and V coming down, no connections among the hidden units. And it had 2 different phases, one where, you and these are local connectivity, by the way. That's why it was very attractive, because, you have your training weights going up locally and coming down locally. And here are the learning rules. Very simple Hebbian learning rule. Mia Cameron, who is an undergraduate, actually figured out how to do that for recurrent networks. It's basically the same type of recirculation learning rule, but it's predictive. That is to say, you're changing the weights. There's a connections that we're putting in. This is a recurrent network, so it's learning to predict the next input. And here's an example of a target after it's learned. So it shows that it might be possible for the brain to do something like this. Recently, Mia has extended that to feed-forward networks. In the wake state, which I'm not showing you, you can train the feed-forward weights and the feedback weights. But in order to be able to do back propagation, you can't do it globally. You can't do it, the way that it's done in backprop, where you take the gradient and you back propagate it. Here, instead of doing that, you can use completely local learning algorithms in order to train the feedback weights to be the pseudo inverse. So each layer basically is able to learn on its own without having to have any global feedback from the output, except what's coming through these feedback connections. So how well does it do? Well, I'm comparing now backprop with this, we call it reciprocal learning. And we're comparing that with another feedback model. Tim Lillicrap just had random connections going back and show that you can also train the network. It's not very efficient. So blue now this is MNIST. Let's look at this is the test loss and this is the test accuracy. So you can see that the reciprocal learns much more quickly and achieves the same asymptotic accuracy that backprop does. Not quite as efficient, but not too bad. And the brain doesn't have to be as efficient as backprop, but it's come pretty close. And it's CFAR2 10. It's a very small data set, and so the performance actually with backprop doesn't get much beyond 40%. But you can see that the reciprocal beats the random. Okay. I want to let you know that I have a book that will be launched next week, October 29th, MIT Press. It was a follow-up of an earlier book I published in 2018 on the deep learning revolution. This book is about ChatGPT, and it's written for the general public, but I have in it lots of juicy things that I think your audience would be interested in, having to do with, various friends of ours who believe in superintelligence, various problems with regulation, various interesting issues having to do with generalization and with gradient descent and double descent. A double descent was, of course, something that was absolutely astonishing to the statisticians who, of course, thought that we would overgeneralize if you had too many parameters. Okay, so that's the story. Here's Max Welling here on the right, and his former student, who's now a postdoc at Harvard. Pat Churchland helped a lot with the TINS paper, and Lyle Muller is the one that was responsible for the recordings from the sleep spindles, and also has been doing some really nice work in doing simulations of the traveling waves and applying it to several different computational problems. So thanks. I'm happy if I have time to answer any question.
Thank you so much, Terry. I am not sure you heard all the clapping, but thank you so much. This was a great talk. We might have time for maybe one very quick question, because we need to move on to the panel discussion, on which we would have loved to have you with us, Terry. That will be hopefully next time. Is your book also coming out in Canada next week?
It is coming out worldwide. You can go to Amazon and buy it right now, pre-order it. It will come to next week. It'll be shipped next week.
Perfect. Wonderful.
Oh, by the way, I also have a Substack. I have a Substack, Brains in AI, which the book was put to bed, sent to the press in September. Since then, a lot of things have happened, as you know, and so I try to keep up with it in my Substack.
Wonderful, perfect. So is there one quick question? Are we ready to move on to the panel discussion? Okay, so I think in the interest of time, in this case, we'll move on straight to the panel discussion. Thank you so much once again, Terry, and we'll look forward to staying in touch, and maybe at some point we'll get you out to Montreal.
Yeah, I'd love to come out there and talk to you, meet you all. Okay, bye, everybody. Have a good meeting.
Thank you. Bye, Terry.